There is a species of loneliness that belongs only to the envied, and it is the coldest there is. It does not keep to empty rooms, it prefers full ones. It lives in a great house lit from cellar to roof on a winter evening, in the shiver of good crystal and the low murmur of trained servants, in the warm gold of 100 candles that fall upon satin and upon silver and warm neither. The world looks at such a house from the road and sees only the lights standing in the windows. It supposes that everyone inside is warm. It never once thinks to ask which of them is permitted to be. The Duchess of Whichcombe was the most envied woman in that part of England, and she had not been warm in a very long time. She understood to the penny the value of what she owned, for others reminded her of it constantly, in the particular manner of people who are telling you of a thing they believe you did not deserve. She owned a name that opened every door for 3 counties around. She owned a house so old and so admired that strangers came on the public days to walk its long gallery and covet its painted ceilings. She owned jewels that 4 duchesses had worn before her, and others would wear long after she was forgotten. She owned, in a word, the whole of what a woman was instructed to want, and had learned within a single season of owning it that a jewel is a thing looked at and never once asked how it does. It is set in gold and kept behind glass, and of the greatest worth to everyone in the room except itself. Her name, before it was made grand, had been Coralie Merivale. She could remember being warm, though the memory had grown thin, the way a thing does when it is held too often and too hard. She remembered a small house and a plain table, and a father who read aloud badly and laughed at himself for it. She remembered when her own name had been only her own, and had cost nothing to say. That was before. Everything in her life now divided cleanly into before and after, and the line between them was one winter night she had not been present to see, and had been made to answer for ever since. She stood this evening at the edge of her own drawing-room, receiving her own guests in her own house, and she was as alone as a woman can be who is surrounded on every side. They came to her and bowed and said the correct things, and watched her the entire while with the bright, patient attention of people waiting for a crack to show in a wall. They had been waiting all the long months of her marriage. She had not yet given them the satisfaction, and she did not mean to begin tonight, for at the far end of the room near the fire, where the warmth was, stood her husband. And beside her husband, close enough that the candlelight made one glowing shape of the two of them, stood the woman the whole of England knew to be his. Seraphine Donnay was not beautiful in the ordinary way, which made her more dangerous than beauty. She was something better than beautiful. She was easy. She moved through a great room as though she had been born owning it, and she laughed at the Duke's rare short remarks as though they were the wittiest things ever spoken, and she laid her hand upon his sleeve with the calm assurance of long possession. Everyone saw it. Everyone was meant to see it. That was the whole point of her, and she performed the point flawlessly, night after night in the wife's own house, under the wife's own roof, with a smile that never slipped and never warmed. Coralie had learned to look at neither of them. She had learned a great many things in 2 years. She had learned to keep her face a still, pleasant, closed thing that gave the watchers nothing. She had learned that the cruelest word in the language is a kind one said in the wrong voice, and that the wrong voice was the only voice this world had for her. And she had learned to live inside a single question she could never ask aloud and could never stop asking. Of all the men in England, why had this one married her? He did not love her. He had never once pretended to. He housed her in splendor and kept her at the length of the whole long house, and set that smiling woman at his side in the light for all to see, and had never given Coralie a reason for any of it. Not on the day he offered for her, not on the day he wed her, nor on any cold day since. He had taken the most ruined woman in England into the highest house in the county, and then held her at arm's length from it, as though she were a thing he had bought and did not want, but could not, for some reason of his own, put down. She did not know the reason. She had stopped. she told herself, wishing to know it. That was a lie, and she knew it was a lie. And she smiled her still closed smile at a baroness who was hoping to see her weep. And she did not weep. To understand how a woman becomes the loneliest soul in a house of 40 servants, you must go back 2 winters, to the thing that was done to her and that she did not do. Coralie Merivale had been 23 and had thought herself, if not happy, then near the edge of it. She was the daughter of a country physician of small means and smaller ambition, a gentle and unworldly man, and she had grown up expecting nothing grander than a modest marriage to a modest man in a village she already knew. Then, one summer, into that quiet neighborhood had come the younger son of a great family, sent down to the country for his health, and his name had been Cassian. He was the brother of a duke, and he ought to have been far above her, and he had not cared a straw for any of it. He was bright and reckless and kind in the careless way of those who have never yet been hurt, and he had loved her with his whole unguarded heart, and she had loved him back with a good deal more caution and no less truth. They were to be married. His family, to the astonishment of the whole county, had not forbidden it. For one summer and one autumn, Coralie Merivale had stood in the full sunlight of a happiness she had not thought was owed to her, and had begun, foolishly, to trust it. He died in the last week of that autumn, on a black, wet night, at the foot of the cliff walk above the sea, and Coralie had not been there. That was the fact of it, the only fact she was ever entirely sure of. She had not been there. What had truly happened on that path in the dark, no living person had told her plainly, and she had come to believe no living person ever would. What the world decided had happened was another matter, and the world decided quickly, as it always does, and it decided against her. They said there had been a quarrel. They said she had used him and thrown him over for a better prospect, and that he had gone out half wild into the storm because of it, and missed his footing in the dark. Some of the lower papers said worse, and left the reader to supply whatever ending suited the appetite. A letter was produced, or half a letter, in a hand that might have been hers, cold and dismissing, though she had written no such thing, and had loved him to the last hour of his life. It made no difference. A dead man cannot say who wrote a letter. A grieving girl of 23 had no friends of weight to say it for her. And a story that lets a whole neighborhood feel virtuous, while it destroys someone, will be believed against any evidence on earth, because people do not wish to give up the pleasure of it. She was ruined inside a fortnight. The great family that had welcomed her closed like a shutter, and her few invitations ceased. Her father, already frail, did not survive the shame of it by a year, and she nursed him to the end in a cottage they could scarcely keep, and buried him, and found herself at 24 entirely alone, with no money, no name worth owning, and a story that walked into every room a half step ahead of her and turned every face to stone. She had believed, standing at her father's grave, that she had already been shown the worst the world had to give her, and that there was at least a bitter freedom in having nothing further to lose. She was wrong on both counts, and she learned it the following spring, when a carriage she did not know drew up at the door of her cold cottage, and a stranger stepped down and asked with cold correctness whether he was addressing Miss Coralie Merivale. The stranger was not the Duke. She understood that much later. He was a lawyer, gray and correct and giving away nothing, and he had come a long way to say a short thing, and he said it standing in her doorway because she had been too proud, or too poor, or too wary to ask him in. He had come, he said, on behalf of his client, to convey an offer of marriage. Coralie had laughed. She could not help it. It came out cracked and unlovely, for she had not laughed in a year, and the sound frightened her more than it frightened him. An offer of marriage, to her. It was so plainly a cruelty, some fresh sport dreamed up by people with time and money to spend on the ruin of the ruined, that she had already begun to close the door when the lawyer said the name of his client, and she stopped, her hand on the wood and the cold air coming in, because the name he said was the last in England she could have imagined. Alaric, Duke of Whitcomb, Cassian's brother, the head of the very house that had shut its doors upon her the hour their son was dead. She did not understand it. She turned it over and over in the days that followed, and could make it yield no shape that was not either a trap or a madness. This was the man whose family her name had disgraced, whose brother the world said she had as good as killed. If any soul on earth had cause to hate Coralie Merivale, to wish her cold and starving and forgotten, it was surely the Duke of Whitcomb. And this was the man who now, through a lawyer at her door, offered to make her his wife and his Duchess, and to set her above the very people who had cast her down. There was no letter in his own hand. There were no reasons given, then or ever. There were only terms, laid out by the lawyer in a flat voice, as though he were leasing her a house. She would be married quietly and at once. She would want for nothing that money could answer. She would take the name and the rank and the protection of the dukedom, and in exchange she would ask no questions and expect no affection, and understand that the marriage was, in the phrase the lawyer used and would not explain, a matter of the duke's own settling of an account. She asked the one question that mattered, the same question she would go on asking silently for 2 years afterward. Why? Why would he, of all men, want her, of all women? The lawyer folded his hands and said that he was not at liberty to say that his grace did not explain himself, and that the offer would stand until the end of the week and not 1 hour longer. And Coralie Merivale, who had nothing and no future and no one, and who had learned already that pride is a luxury for those with a warm room to be proud in, made the only choice a person can make when there is no choice left to make. She said yes to a man she had never met, who by every right should have despised her, for a reason he would not give. The carriage that came for her a week later was warm inside, and she sat in the warmth and hated how good it was, and told herself she was riding toward either her rescue or her ruin, and that she could not for her life have said which. She was wrong about that too. It was to be neither, and both, and a great deal stranger than either. And it began the moment the gates of Whitcomb closed behind her. The gates of Whitcomb closed behind the carriage with a sound like a held breath let slowly go, and Coralie sat forward against the seat, bracing as a person braces for a blow that has been a long time promised. She had built the house in her mind across the 2 days of the road, and she had built it grim. She had reasoned that a house of grief and old hatred would surely look the part that the family which had closed its doors upon her the very night its son was lost would keep those doors shrouded and cold against her forever. She had expected a mausoleum, and to be received as a thing swept in off the highway and suffered indoors for a purpose no one would name. Whitcomb was not a mausoleum. It lay long and low and gold in the last of the west light, an old gray house grown up out of its green valley over many hundreds of years, with no plan anyone could now recover, its windows lit warm, its chimneys sending up their smoke straight and untroubled into the still evening. It looked, of all the impossible things, like a house that was loved. That was the last quality she had armed herself against, and it undid her guard more thoroughly than grimness could have done. Grimness she had a shape for. This she had none. She was met by the housekeeper and taken up to rooms that had been made ready with a care that stopped her at the threshold. There was a fire drawn and tended. There were flowers out of season and dear, the small white kind that had grown along the lane of her childhood, and nowhere in this county at all. And when she crossed to the windows to steady herself, she saw that every one of them gave upon the hills, upon the fold of the green valley, climbing away inland, and not one upon the distant silver line of the sea. She stood very still. Someone had chosen these rooms for her. Someone had thought before ever she arrived that the woman coming to this house had lost the man she loved on a cliff above the water, and that she might not wish of a morning to open her eyes upon the sea. Someone in this house of her enemies had taken that trouble, silently, and would never mention it, and did not mean her to know it had been taken. It unsettled her more than any cruelty could have. A cruelty she could have understood. She had 2 years of understanding it. This she could not read at all, and a kindness you cannot read is a door in the dark you cannot find the edges of. It was the housekeeper who gave her the first thread, and gave it. Coralie came to see, on purpose. Mistress Rundle was a broad, plain, upright woman of near 70, who had been at Witchcombe her whole life, and had, it was soon plain, nursed the Duke himself when he was a boy small enough to hold. She had a blunt country way of speaking, and a pair of shrewd eyes that missed nothing, and she talked that first evening in a steady, homely stream, while she saw Coralie fed and settled, and it took Coralie some while to understand that the talk was a mercy, laid down to cover the silences of the house and give a frightened woman something to lean against, until she stopped trembling. She would tell her Mistress Rundle said the little that was hers to tell, and no more, for the rest was not hers, and never would be. This was a good house once, she said, and would be again, God willing, though it had gone hard and quiet these 2 years and more. There were doors in the east wing that were kept shut, and Coralie would oblige them all by not trying them, and by not asking why, and by not speaking, ever, within these walls, a certain name. She did not need to. It hung in the room the way the cold hangs before snow. "The master," said Mistress Rundle, and here her blunt voice gentled, in a way that told Coralie more than the words did. The master was not always the man she would meet tomorrow. He had been the warmest, openest lad that ever ran wild in this valley, quick to laugh and quicker to trust, and a body could have warmed their hands at him. Something had frozen that lad some 2 years since and more, and Mistress Rundle had watched it happen and could do nothing, and would say only this and then hold her tongue. Whatever her new mistress saw in the Duke of Witchcombe, whatever coldness, whatever hard-closed thing that looked like not caring, she was to remember that she was seeing the scar and not the wound, and that a scar is only the place where a body is healed the one way it could. Then the old woman rose and straightened the coverlet with hands that shook a very little, and went to the door. There was one more thing, she said, that Coralie had best hear from her tonight, and not have flung at her tomorrow by someone less kind. There was a lady who came often to this house, and would go on coming, and sat where a wife might sit, and Coralie was to ask nothing of that either. Then Mistress Rundle looked at her a long moment with her shrewd old eyes, as though weighing whether to add a thing, and decided against it, and only said, "Good night," and that Coralie was not to believe the whole of what she would be shown here, for not the whole of it was true. And she went out and left that sitting in the room like a coal. She met the Duke of Witchcombe the following morning, and understood within a minute why the whole world was afraid of him, and why the whole world was wrong. He was tall and dark, and younger than she had somehow expected, though the darkness under his eyes had aged him past his years. His face was a still, guarded, handsome thing that gave away nothing at all. Schooled to it, she thought, the way a soldier's hand is schooled to be steady, and when those eyes came to rest on her, she braced once more for the thing she had braced for at every door for 2 years, the look that measured a fallen woman and found her wanting, or worse, found her interesting. It did not come. What was in his eyes when he looked at her she could not name at first, for she had no recent use for it. It was not scorn, and it was not want. It looked impossibly like something owed. It looked like a man regarding a debt so old and so heavy that it had become a part of how he stood. He bowed to her with perfect correctness. He welcomed her to Witchcombe in a low, even voice and a very few words, told her the house and its grounds and its library were hers to use as she pleased, that the servants were instructed to treat her word as law, and that she should never on any account want for a single thing that money or comfort could supply. He said, all of it, as a man reads terms he has already written and means to keep to the letter. And then, without a flicker, in the same even courteous voice, he told her the other thing, the thing that turned the whole warm, strange house to ice around her. A friend of his, a Lady Seraphine Donnay, would be much at Whitcomb. Coralie would receive her with civility. Coralie would ask him nothing concerning her, then or ever. That was the one condition of their life together, he said, and it was not open to discussion, and he was sorry for it in a voice that did, for one word, sound as though it truly was. She could make no sense of him. He had given her a house, a name, a rank, the freedom of everything he owned, and a woman installed in her own home to shame her before the county, and he had given her not one reason for any part of it. She went back to her rooms with her head ringing. It was on the table when she returned the morning paper, folded, left for her, as it would be left every morning after, and when she opened it she found that a column had been cut cleanly out of it with a knife, a neat empty window where some article had been, and she knew without being told what the article had said, for she had read 100 like it. And she understood that some hand in this house had gone through her paper before it reached her and taken the cruelty out of it so that she should not have to meet it over her morning chocolate. No one told her whose hand. No one ever would. But it was done that morning, and it was done every morning she lived at Whitcomb, and it was the second thing the cold Duke had quietly done for her before she had been one full day under his roof, and she could not for the life of her fit it against the woman he had just told her to expect at his side. For the first weeks she lived at Whitcomb, as one lives in a house that may at any moment prove to be quietly on fire. She had learned, in 2 hard years, the single great law of the fallen. Nothing is given for nothing. Every warmth carries its price, and the price is cruelest in the giving that looked kindest. So she watched. She watched the warm rooms and the deferring servants, the flowers renewed and the papers cut, and she waited, every nerve drawn tight, for the hour the account would be laid before her, and she would learn what all of it had been the first payment upon. The hour did not come. She waited for the Duke to require of her the thing that men in such arrangements are said to require. He required nothing. He never came to her rooms. He never held her hand a moment past what a bow asked of it. She waited for the humiliation to turn private as well as public, for the mistress to be pressed upon her in some sharper way. It was not. Lady Seraphine was there always, smiling, seated where a wife should sit, and yet Coralie began to see, with the slow disbelief of a person learning to read a language she had been told was gibberish, that the Duke never once gave the woman a warmth. His cold face seemed truly to feel. There was performance in it. She could not have said how she knew. She knew the way one tells a painted window from a true one by the quality of the light behind it. The cruelty was real in what it did to her, and false at its source, and she could not fathom a man who would take such trouble to be cruel and not mean a word of it. And still the small mercies came, silent, unclaimed, impossible. The white flowers of a lane 6 counties away, the windows that spared her the sea. The cruelty knifed each dawn from her paper by a hand that wished neither thanks nor even to be known. She lay awake and set the mercies in one hand and the mistress in the other, and could not bring the scales to sit level, and it unsettled her past bearing, for hatred she could have armed against, and this she could not, and a thing you cannot understand is a thing you can never once be safe from. There was a price. She was certain of it still. She simply could not find it. And the not finding of it, though she did not yet know this, was the truest thing she had learned of the Duke of Whitcomb, and she would go a long and aching while before she understood what it meant. Let us pause there a moment. If you are the kind of soul these stories were made for, subscribe before we go on, so the next of them finds its way to you and is not lost in the crowd. She found the shape of the truth, in the end, not in the great house but out beyond it, in the lanes and cottages of the estate, and she found it entirely by accident, because the Duke had taken the greatest care that it should never be found at all. The first of it came on a raw gray morning in her 3rd week, when she walked out past the walled garden and came upon a young housemaid weeping into her apron behind the laundry. The girl was new, a thin, frightened creature named Win, and when Coralie gently drew the trouble out of her, it was a trouble Coralie knew to the marrow of her own bones. The girl had been in service in a great house in the next shire, and a jealous upper servant had accused her falsely of taking a missing brooch, and on that word alone the girl had been turned off without a character, which in that world is another way of sentencing a young woman to starve. No house would take a maid dismissed for theft. She had walked the roads a fortnight until her boots gave out and her small savings with them, and she had all but given up hope of any door opening to her again. And then a man she had never seen, a plain steward on a plain horse, had found her on the road with a paper in his hand, a written place at Whitcomb, wages and a bed and a fresh start and no questions asked, and never a word of who had sent him, or how the master of a house 6 shires off had come to know that a nameless ruined girl was on that particular road on that particular day. Coralie stood very still in the cold. She knew that road. She had walked a road like it herself. She began, after that, to see the pattern everywhere, once she had the trick of looking. There was a boy from the village, the clever son of a dead plowman, whose fees at a good school in the town were paid each term by a lawyer out of what the lawyer called a fund, so that the boy need never know he was any man's charity and carry the weight of it. There was. Everywhere she turned, once her eyes were opened, the same careful, dairy, self-effacing goodness, done always through a third hand, so that the giving could never be followed back to a giver, and no one need ever kneel to be grateful. It was an old woman in the village who put words to it. An old woman named Goodwife Trant, who did not know Coralie for the Duchess and spoke to her over a cottage gate as country people speak of a marvel. Her grandson had been dying of a wasting fever, she said, and the London physician who might have mended him charged a fee no cottage would see in 10 years of Sundays, and she had made her peace with losing the boy, for that is what the poor learn to do. And then the physician had come, all that long way of his own accord, sent for and paid by a hand that left no name, and the boy was living yet and grown tall, and no one had ever come to be thanked for it. Some do say, the old woman told her, dropping her voice, that it is the Duke, the cold one up at the great house, him with the fancy woman and the wronged wife. But I say it cannot be, for how should a hard, cruel man do such a thing in secret, and never once let on? No, said Goodwife Trant, shaking her head. I put a man in my prayers by no name at all, for I have none to give him, and I reckon the Lord above knows well enough the one, I mean whatever the great house says of its master. Coralie walked home with that, turning over and over in her, and it would not settle, and it would not leave. She had come to Whitcomb believing herself the only creature in the county who owed the Duke a debt she could not put a name to. She understood now that she was one of a great and scattered company, a whole quiet nation of the saved, tucked into the cottages and the lanes and the far rooms of the house, every one of them putting a nameless man into their prayers, none of them dreaming that the nameless man was the very one the county pointed at, and pitied his wife, and called a cold, faithless thing behind his back. And she came home that gray afternoon, and went to the library as she had lately taken to doing, and stopped in the doorway with her hand at her throat, for on the shelf nearest the window, where a week before there had been a gap, there now stood 3 books she would have known blind, in the dark, by the feel of their worn spines alone. They were her father's. His own small good collection, sold off the week he died to pay men he had never truly owed, scattered to the auction rooms 2 years since and 100 miles away, and they were here. Someone had hunted them down one by one, across 2 years and half of England, and was setting them back upon a shelf where she would find them, quietly, a few at a time, and saying nothing, and meaning her never to know. She sat down on the floor of the great library with her father's books in her lap, and did the thing she had trained herself for 2 years never to do. She wept silently and wholly, and could not have said, if her life had hung upon it, whether it was grief or something else that had at last come up through the ice. Nothing she had learned made a shape she could yet name. She only understood sitting among the return books that the man she had been given to was not the man the world had shown her, that behind the cold mask and the smiling mistress there was a locked and buried thing, and that she had begun, against all her hard-learned wisdom, to want with her whole starved heart to know what it was. The library became theirs, though neither of them ever said so, and it was in the library that they came, slowly and almost without words, to know one another. It happened at the gray hour before the house woke, the 1 hour that belonged to no one else. Lady Seraphine did not rise before noon. The servants kept to the back of the house, and Coralie, who slept badly, took to going down into the great, cold, beautiful room while it was still dark, to be among the books and, though she did not admit it, among her father's returning shelf. And there, the third such morning, she found the Duke already before her, standing at the window with a book and the first light on his hard-closed face. And she stopped and made to withdraw, and he said, without turning, in a voice quite unlike the flat, cold one he wore before the county, that she need not go, that the room was as much hers as his, perhaps, and that he had learned, long ago. There was no better company than a book, and no company at all. He minded less than a person who understood that. So she stayed, and it became, without either of them once naming it, a habit, and then a thing depended upon. They did not speak of anything that mattered. They could not. There was a whole country of things forbidden between them, the mistress and the marriage and the account he would not name, and the room in the east wing whose door was always shut, and they both knew the borders of that country to an inch and never once crossed them. But within the small safe ground that was left, in the gray hour over the books, a strange thing grew. She would say some sharp, true thing about a page, some argument she thought wrong-headed, and forget for a moment to be careful, and he would answer, dry and exact and unexpectedly funny, and the cold mask he wore for the world was simply not there in that light. She learned that he was clever in a quiet, devastating way, that he had read everything and believed almost none of it, and loved a few things fiercely, and would not say which. And she learned that his rare, real smile, when some argument of hers surprised it out of him, changed his whole face into the face of the open, warm-hearted boy Mistress Rundle had grieved, the one that something had frozen. One morning she found upon the table, left where she would see it, a fourth of her father's books, and beside it, in a plain upright hand on a folded scrap of paper, the only written thing he ever gave her, 3 words, and no more. They said, only, I am sorry. There was no name to it, and no explaining, and she did not know, would not know for a long while, whether he was sorry for her father's books, or for the mistress at his side, or for the whole cold architecture of the life he had built her, and she found she could not ask, and put the paper in her pocket where it stayed. She began to defend him without meaning to. That was how she first understood how far she had come. A cousin of Lady Seraphine's, a smooth, unpleasant man down from town, sat at the Duke's table one evening and, thinking to flatter the mistress and amuse the room, made his little jokes about the master of the house, the cold Duke, the silent, proud man who was surely, one had always heard, not quite right in his upper room, and had no more warmth in him than a stone in December. And Coralie, who had every reason on the earth to sit still and let the man be mocked, who had been wronged by him before the whole county, and had every right to enjoy the sight of another taking her part against him, set down her glass and heard herself speak. She said that the gentleman was mistaken. She said she had lived under this roof some months now, and had seen a broken old man kept in honor, at a gate he could barely tend, and a ruined girl saved off a cold road, and a dying child mended by a physician fetched 100 miles, and every last stroke of it done by a hand that went to the greatest lengths never to be glimpsed at its work or thanked for it. She said that was not the work of a man with no warmth in him, but of a man with a very great deal of it, who had for some reason of his own chosen to spend it only where it could do good, and never where it could earn him credit, and that she would rather sit at the table of one such man than at the tables of 10 who were charming over the tea, and did nothing for anyone but themselves. And she said she wished there were more of him in England, and fewer of the sort that tapped their heads and smiled over a good man's silence. There was a silence. The smooth man's smile went stiff. Down the table, Lady Seraphine's smile did not move at all, and her eyes came to rest on Coralie with a new and cold and calculating attention, as on a thing that had proved unexpectedly capable of movement. And Coralie, her heart going hard, understood two things in the same breath: that she had just defended, fiercely and before witnesses, the very man the world thought her wronger, and that she had meant every word of it, and would say it all again. She did not see the Duke's face. She heard later that he had heard of it, for he heard of everything at Whitcomb. And the next grey morning, upon the library table there was another book of her father's, and this time no written word beside it at all, only the book, set square. As a man sets down a thing when he cannot trust his hand to write and cannot trust his voice to speak. Hold there one moment more before the turn, and if this is the sort of story you would not wish to miss, subscribe now, so that what comes next, and it is the heart of the whole matter, comes to you. It was Mistress Rundle who could bear the not telling no longer, and so it was Mistress Rundle who ended it. She came up to Coralie's rooms on a bright, iron-cold afternoon in the deep of winter, and she did a thing she had never once done before. She closed the door. Then she stood with her broad red hands folded and her old face gone grave, and said that she was about to go back on a promise she had given her master, that she would settle that reckoning with her Maker and no soul else alive, and that she had grown far too old to watch a decent woman come apart for the want of a truth. "I have watched it eating at you these many weeks, child," she said. "I will give you my own half of it this afternoon. The other half belongs to him, and you will have it from his own mouth, or you will never have it at all, and heaven alone can say whether he will ever find the tongue for it." Then she lowered herself into the chair beside the fire, slow and careful, the way the very old sit down, and she began. The name that no one under this roof was suffered to speak, she said, was Cassian. He had been the master's own younger brother, the brightest thing this gray valley had ever grown, and the master had loved him past all sense or measure, the way a careful soul loves a reckless one, as though the boy carried some warmth the elder had none of his own. And Cassian, 2 winters gone, had loved a girl, a country doctor's daughter, with no fortune and no family to speak of, so far beneath what the world expected of him, that the whole county laid bets on how the great house would stamp it out, and the great house had not stamped it out. For the old Duke was dead by then, and the master was the house, and the master looked at his brother, lit up like a window at Christmas, and could refuse him nothing, and gave the match his blessing before the girl's own father had done gaping at the honor of it. Here the old woman paused and looked at Coralie very steadily out of her shrewd old eyes, and Coralie found that her own hands had gone quite cold in her lap, for she had seen, a long moment before the words arrived, precisely where this road came out. "The girl," said Mistress Rundle gently, "was yourself." Coralie did not speak. She could not. The old woman went on, quieter now. "He never told you at the offer, nor after, for he could not bring himself to it. You and Cassian kept to your own green corner of the county that summer and autumn. The master was away the whole of it, upon the affairs the title had dropped on him, so that you two never met in the flesh, not once, but he knew you all the same, out of every letter his brother sent, for every letter that boy wrote was 3 parts you, and the master came in the end to love you a little himself, off the page, for his brother's sake, before ever he saw your living face. And then," said the old woman, and her voice turned hard as a flint, "there was the night on the cliff path, and the boy at the foot of it in the morning, cold, and the tale that grew up over his grave like a weed, the tale that laid the whole of it at your door. And I will tell you the thing the world was never told, the thing the master has spent the better part of 2 years and the greater part of his fortune setting out to prove. You never did it. There was a letter found buttoned inside the boy's coat that night, a cruel, flat little letter breaking the whole thing off between you, penned in a hand, got up to pass for yours, and it was that letter and no temper of his own that sent him out half wild along the edge in a black gale to slip and go over. You wrote not one word of it. It was written to divide you two by a person who wanted the boy and could not come at him while you stood in the way. And when it killed him outright, instead of freeing him, that same person let your name take the whole weight of the blame and buried her own hand inside your ruin where none would think to dig for it. Coralie's lips shaped the question with almost no breath behind it. Who? She sits at his table of an evening, said Mistress Rundle, in the chair a wife should sit in, and she smiles while she does it. And then the old woman told her the last piece, the piece that turned 2 frozen years over in Coralie's understanding like a spade turning wet earth. When they carried the boy home, the master, who was then no cold and shuttered thing but as open and trusting a young man as ever drew breath, had gone straight out among the family and the magistrates and spoken. He had spoken all of it wild with grief and armed with not one scrap of proof, naming aloud the woman he believed had done it, and swearing the doctor's daughter as innocent as the dead, and they had laughed at him. Grief had unseated his wits. They told one another comfortably. And worse, they turned his very speaking into one more stone to sling at you. For look, they said, the wretched girl has not a friend in the world to plead for her save a half-mad boy raving out of his own guilt. And if that is the whole of her defense, then the case must be black indeed. His speaking had not lifted a feather's weight off you. It had helped, God forgive them, to press you under. And a thing of that sort, said Mistress Rundle, lo, will teach a man to hold his tongue for life. It taught him. From that morning, he never again trusted his open heart or his open word to do anything but damage. He shut them both away like plate in a strong box. He taught himself to do in secret, and behind a cold face and through a lawyer's hand, all the good he no longer dared attempt out loud. And he set himself, patient as a stone, 2 long years, to gather up the proof he had lacked in that first raw season, the proof that would lift your name clear and pull hers down into the mire where it belonged. And he keeps her here, smiling and easy in her mind, certain she has carried the day, so that she will not take fright and bolt before the hour comes, that he can spring the whole of it at once. The coldness you have borne, the woman planted at his side, the whole cruel show of it, was never meant for you. It was staged for her, that she might sleep sound and never feel the net drawing closed. He married you to fold you under his own name, while he finished the work and told you nothing, because that honest face of yours would have given the game away inside a fortnight. Coralie sat a long while in the bright, cold room after the old woman had gone down the stairs, and she saw, all together and all at once, the meaning of everything. The rooms that faced the safe green hills and never the water. The white flowers off a lane 6 counties distant, the gutted newspaper laid fresh each dawn, her father's books walking home to her, 2 or 3 at a time. The thing she had read in his eyes that first gray morning and mistaken for the boredom of a man saddled with a wife he had not wanted, which had been, all along the look of a man, bent double under a grief, and a guilt too heavy to be spoken of. She and the silent man had been broken by one single night, only they had stood on its 2 opposite sides. His locked tongue and her blackened name were not 2 separate sorrows at all. They were one sorrow halved, and she had been married, all unknowing to the missing half of her own. The knowing did not bring her joy. That was the bitter twist of it, and she was too honest a woman to pretend to herself that it did. For beneath all the wonder of the thing lay a cold, hard pebble. She could not get down. Every gentleness of that strange winter, every buried mercy, and every homecoming book had been done for a dead man and an old debt, and toward an end fixed in this man's mind long before ever she was carried up his drive. He had never, in all his soundless planning, intended her to matter to him on her own living account. She was a reckoning paid off, the last unsettled line at the foot of a ledger begun on a cliff in the dark. He was scrupulous with her precisely the way a man is scrupulous with a creditor. He knows himself to have wronged, and no more than that, and she grasped, sitting alone with it while the fire burned down. That, somewhere in those quiet mornings, over the books she had gone and committed the one folly she had sworn at her father's graveside never to permit herself again. Not the frozen Duke, the county pitied and whispered over the other one. The one who had left 3 unsigned words on a folded scrap and could not put his name beneath them. The one who had gone out and hunted down a dead country doctor's books. She had her pride still, very near the only thing she had carried out of the wreck of her old life, intact, and it was a cutting thing to a proud woman to find herself in love with a man who was merely being conscientious out of remorse for a ruin he blamed himself for. It seemed to her, in the first raw days of the knowing, that the one course that left her any ground to stand upon was to leave. To hand him back the last unpaid line of his account, and walk out of Witchcombe, carrying the one possession they could neither buy back nor cut from a newspaper, which was what remained of her dignity, and leave him to his patient net and the justice he was owed, without the daily reproach of a wife who ached for a thing he had never offered. She had all but settled it in her mind, and then she did not go, and the reason she stayed was the very thing that turned the whole story after it. For it was not weakness that kept her, nor simply her wanting of him, though the wanting was tangled up in it. It was that she had seen across those gray mornings, the living man behind the mask, the good heart that had walled itself up inside a silence 2 years thick over a hurt that no one had ever once attempted to touch, let alone heal. And she could not turn her back on such a man and leave him to freeze there, when she might be the one soul on earth fitted to reach him, for his hurt and her hurt were the self-same hurt. And who could thaw him if not the other half of his own broken knight? She had come to Witchcombe to be rescued. She stayed because she had begun to understand that she might instead be the one who did the rescuing, and that this, to a woman who had lost every other thing, was worth more than any warm bed or any name washed clean. She had believed that gift, buried for good with her father. It was not. And so she stayed, but she was not, as it fell out, to be left the quiet in which to do it, for the woman in the wife's chair had not sat there smiling all these weeks with her eyes shut, and she had seen the very thing that Coralie had failed to hide half well enough. Lady Seraphine Donnay had raised the whole of her life, ever since one night above the sea, upon a single buried bone, and she guarded it the way a half-drowned creature clutches the one spar keeping its chin above water, because it was the entire sum of what she had. She had felt the floor tilt under her the night Coralie rose at the table and spoke up for the Duke before the county. She had marked the thaw creeping into a marriage she had been promised with so much cold ash, and she understood, with the pitiless instinct of the guilty, exactly what a warming marriage threatened. It meant a wife who might one gray morning be told things. It meant a net whose edges she could no longer keep in view. It meant that the ruined girl she had put down once, and reckoned safely down for good, had somehow risen again to become the one loose thread that could unpick her whole embroidered life. So she moved, the way such people move, before the thread could be found and pulled. She struck first, and she struck to kill, and she chose her ground with all her old cold care. The great assembly of the county fell that year as it fell every year in the long paneled rooms of the assembly house in the county town, and the whole of the world would be there, every creature who counted for anything within 30 miles, and it was there, in the most public glare there was to be had, that Lady Seraphine laid her plan to break the Duchess of Witchcombe past all mending, to shame her so wholly and so openly in front of the assembled county that she must fly the place forever and take her dangerous knowledge away with her and never dare return. She had done the very thing once before to a doctor's daughter of 23, with a forged letter and a soft word dropped in the right ear. She did not entertain a moment's doubt that she could do it a second time. She was so entirely certain she had already won. That was the flaw at the heart of her, the thing that would bring her down. He had built her whole campaign, as she had built her whole existence, upon the surest wager in England that the cold Duke of Witchcombe would do at that assembly the identical thing he had done at every gathering for 2 years running. He would stand mute along the wall and let the current take the girl out. His silence was the one fixed star in that county sky, and she had staked everything she owned upon it, twice over now, and collected once. She did not know that the net was already pulled tight. She did not know that 3 weeks earlier a plain lawyer had laid at last into the Duke's waiting hands the final piece he had wanted all this while, the true letter, the proof of the hand that shaped it, and the sworn word of the servant who had carried it up the cliff path in the dark. She did not know the reckoning was ready now to be paid to the last farthing, in the open, before them all, and she could not have dreamed that the one force able to make the silent Duke break 2 years of silence and speak aloud before the entire staring county was a thing that had come up his drive 8 months before, with all it owned in a single trunk and no morning to look forward to, and had quietly thawed the frozen thing at the middle of him, without either of them ever naming what was happening between them. She went to him the night before the assembly. In the whole of that long winter, she had never once sought him out to speak of anything that truly mattered. She sought him now. He was at work in his study, the candles burning low, his pen traveling steadily down a page, and he lifted his head when she came in at the door, and something crossed his guarded face at the sight of her and was mastered again as fast as it had risen. She stood on the threshold and made herself say it, all of it, and say it plainly, because he was a man who had taught himself to believe in nothing but what was solid and real, and a plain truth spoken plainly was the most real thing she had left in her keeping to offer him. "I know," she said, "I know about Cassian and the letter and what was truly done that night, and by whose hand. I know why you married me, and why my windows all face the hills, and why my father's books have been finding their way home to me all the winter through. I know it was a debt. Wisette, she told me, and you are not to be angry with her, for she only did it to spare me a worse folly than the telling." And she held his gaze and made herself come to the hard part. "You have settled it, your grace. You have settled it 10 times over, and more. You owe my father's memory not one thing further, and you owe me nothing whatever. Tomorrow that woman means to break me in front of the whole county so that I will run, and it seems to me the kindest thing, and very likely the only sensible thing, is that I should let her have her victory, and go quietly, and carry the danger of me out of your house, and leave you your peace at the last. I release you from the final line of the account. Let me go." There was a long stillness in the room, and it was not made of the same stuff as all the cold stillnesses before it. She watched him reach, out of 2 years of unbroken habit, for the pen to set down his answer in ink as he had set down every answer for 2 years. And she watched him look at the pen a moment in his own hand and lay it back upon the desk, and the Duke of Witchcombe, who had not spoken one honest word of his own heart aloud to any living creature since a night above the sea 2 winters gone, rose from his chair and came round the desk to her and used his voice. "No," he said. It was a single word, low, and cracked at the edges from long disuse, and the saying of it plainly cost him something, and it was, she thought, the most astonishing sound she had ever heard a man make. "No," he said again, and the second time the word came steadier, still rough, but level now, a man taking hold of a tool he had let go, rusty. "You will not go. I let you believe it a debt, because a debt was a shape I knew how to carry. I have carried everything I own across these 2 years in silence, and told myself the whole while that the silence was good sense, and I was a coward, and I have finished with being one. It was a debt once." He stopped, and seemed to hunt back for the very hour, and to find it. It stopped being a debt on the third gray morning in that library, when you told me plainly I was wrong about a book, and were entirely right, and did not trouble yourself that I was a duke while you said it. I did not tell you so. I had long since stopped believing any word out of my mouth could make a thing safer or truer, or worth the hazard of the speaking. So I let you go on thinking yourself a sum to be paid off and struck through, and that of all the unkindnesses I have done you this winter, is the one I would most gladly take back." He drew a slow breath. "Tomorrow she will not break you. I will not permit it, and I will not permit it by the one road I swore 2 years ago I would never set foot on again, because you have taught me this winter, without ever once setting out to, that I had the whole of it backwards. I believed the worst fate that could befall a man was to speak a true thing and watch it wound. I have learned there is a worse fate, by far. It is to hold a truth in your 2 hands that might set the world to rights, and to sit down on top of it, and to give your sitting the fine name of prudence. I called my fear prudence for 2 years. You have lifted the name off it, and left me staring at the plain shape underneath." She could not answer him. She, who had done the whole of the talking through that winter, stood mute in the doorway of his study, with no word anywhere in her, and something at the hard corner of his mouth shifted. The barest beginning of a thing she had scarcely ever caught there. "You begin to see," he said more softly, "how the matter stands. It is a far easier business to talk another soul into courage than to lay hands on your own. When the turn of it comes round at long last to your own door, go and sleep. Put your trust in me. And do not," he said, "speak to me again of leaving." And then, for the first time in all their months, he spoke her name aloud. Slowly, the way a man handles a thing he has kept a long while wrapped and put by key. There are 2 years of words dammed up behind my teeth that I never once let past. I mean to let every one of them out into the daylight now, and I mean to begin the letting tomorrow, in the very room where words were once used to sink you. The great assembly was the most crowded that anyone could bring to mind, for the whole county had poured into it fairly alight with the tale of the Duchess of Witchcombe, and the Duke's kept woman, and Lady Seraphine arrived at the very crown of her powers, sure past all doubting that the night was already hers. She swept into the long, bright rooms in her finest silk, and was received like visiting royalty, and she permitted herself, as she greeted this soul and that, the smallest and most gracious of sighing references to poor dear Witchcombe, and to the Duchess, of whom she let it be gently understood. The less that was said just now, the more merciful to all concerned. She watched her little poisoned whispers go out and do their quiet work through the room, and she was well content. Coralie had not wished to come at all. He had asked it of her in that rough, relearned voice of his, and she had found there was nothing he could ask her in that voice that she was able to refuse when the asking cost him so dear. So she came on the arm of old Mistress Rundle into the long, glittering rooms, packed with the very people who had barred every door in England against her, and she carried her head level, and she waited to be cut, and cut she was, thoroughly, by 100 of them at a stroke, the shoulders turning away, the little clear circle of empty floor widening around her, as though whatever had befallen her might be caught by standing too near. She bore it. She had borne worse and borne it with less. And at the peak of it, in the moment, most carefully chosen, with the whole room watching from the sides of its 100 eyes, Lady Seraphine crossed to her, wearing her pleasant, unmoving smile, and said gently, sweetly, and just loudly enough to carry, that it was so very brave of the Duchess to venture out among people at all, everything considered, and that she did so hope the poor creature might find some good distance from here, the quiet, retiring life that so plainly suited her, and that no one surely would think ill of her were she to slip away home now, for the strain must be very great indeed. It was the blow struck out in the open, in front of every one of them. It was the moment built with care to shatter her and drive her out of the county for good. And Corley, who had learned across 3 hard years exactly how to lose a thing without letting the losing show, dipped her head to the smiling woman and turned her carriage unbroken and her face perfectly still, and walked away from her across the long shining floor toward the far doors, and the crowd drew itself back to let the ruined Duchess pass. And behind her, sure now, and wholly of her triumph, Lady Seraphine Dany smiled. And then the Duke of Witchcombe stepped out from the wall. For a moment the room did not grasp what it was looking at, for the cold Duke had been standing along the edge of it, as he forever stood silent, as he forever was, and half of them had clean forgotten he was in the building at all. They saw him move. They drew aside to let him through as they had always drawn aside, supposing he meant to slip away, or to carry some cold private syllable off into a corner. He did not go toward the doors. He walked instead to the very middle of the long room, into the full blaze of the chandeliers, and he stopped there, and he turned, and he set his face to the whole staring county, and he did the one thing that not a soul in that place had seen him do in 2 years. He raised his voice to all of them, and that voice, cracked on the first word, and firming on the second and coming clear as a struck bell by the third, went out across the long, bright rooms and hushed them the way a flat palm laid across a plucked string will hush it, so that between one heartbeat and the next, the entire glittering assembly stood without a sound. "You must bear with me," said the Duke of Witchcombe. "If I make a poor business of this, I am much out of practice, as every one of you has been kind enough to remark behind a lifted hand these 2 years past. You have spun a great length of cloth out of my quiet. You have called it pride, and you have called it a disordered mind, and you have called it a cold heart, and you have called it names I will not repeat in front of this company. I mean to tell you tonight what it truly was. I have found, late and at a price I would wish on none of you, a reason worth the breaking of it. And I have always held that a thing worth saying is owed first, and owed plainest, to the very room that made the saying necessary." He let his eyes go once down the length of the floor to Corley, halted now at the far doors and turned back to look at him, and then he brought them out again across all the rest. 3 years ago, he said, a young man of this county died in the dark at the foot of the cliff walk above the sea. He was my brother. I loved him better than I have ever loved my own life. And a girl he loved, and meant before the year was out to marry, a girl as clean of any part in his death as any person breathing in this room tonight, was made to shoulder the blame of it, and was destroyed for it, and hounded from every respectable door in England upon the strength of a letter she never set her hand to. A low murmur ran the length of the room. He waited it out. "I knew she was innocent," he said. "I knew it 2 years ago. I stood up, in a gathering not unlike this one, out of my mind with grief, and without a shred of proof to my name, and I said aloud the thing I knew, and I named the hand I believed had truly done it, and you laughed in my face. Some of you, standing here tonight, laughed in my face. You said grief had turned the poor young Duke's wits, and then you took my speaking and you used it as one more stone to fling at her. For see, you told each other, the girl has not one defender left in the world, but a raving half-mad boy. And if that is all she can muster, then the truth of the matter must be blacker than we feared. My speaking did not save her. It helped, that night, to bury her. And I learned, standing there, the lesson that you taught me, which was that a bare truth counts for exactly nothing in a room such as this one, that it must come freighted with proof heavy enough to drop clean through the floorboards before any of you will trouble to glance down and see it lying there. So I shut my mouth on the lot of you, and for 2 years I have gone quietly about, well out of your sight, gathering that weight, doing with my hands and my purse the good I no longer dared trust to my tongue, The gathering is finished now. I have the whole of it in my hand tonight." He drew from inside his coat a folded sheaf of papers and lifted it high above his head, and the room went so still that the guttering of the candles could be heard along the walls. "The letter that killed my brother," said the Duke. "The cold, false little letter that broke his heart in two and sent him out along the edge in the storm, was never written by the woman all of you condemned for it. It was written to part them, in a hand carefully forged to pass for hers, by a woman who wanted him for her own, and could not have him while another stood in her way, and who, when her forgery killed him outright rather than delivering him, stood back in her fine silk and let an innocent girl carry the guilt of it for 2 long years, so that her own hand might stay buried in the ruin forever. I hold the proof of it. Here, the true letter, the proof of the hand that shaped the false one, the sworn and witnessed confession of the servant who is paid to carry it, and who has told the whole of it at last, for the easing of his own soul." His voice went hard and climbed. "The woman who forged that letter, who killed my brother, as surely as though she had set her 2 hands on his chest and pushed, and who has sat these 2 years, smiling in my house while an innocent woman bore the whole cost of her crime, stands among you now, and her name is Lady Seraphine Danae. There is a stillness heavier than any uproar, the stillness of a whole crowded room arriving at one understanding in the same instant, and wishing to God it had not, and that stillness came down now over the long, bright rooms, and did not lift again the rest of the night. In the middle of it, quite alone, Lady Seraphine stood with her pleasant smile gone from her face at last, and all together, and one after another, slowly, every head in that great gathering turned upon its neck to look at her. She had raised the whole of her life upon a dead boy's name, and a thing buried deep, and the thing was dug up now and held aloft in a duke's hand in front of every creature whose good opinion had been the sum of her fortune, and there was no soft sigh left that could paper over it, and no cold turn of a shoulder that could push it aside. She looked, in that moment, not like the queen of the county she had played so long and so cleverly, but like the thing she had been the whole while underneath the playing, a frightened woman who had stood watch over a grave for 2 years, and had lived to see it broken open in the light before them all. She said nothing. There was nothing left in the world to say. She gathered up what little remained to her of her dignity, and she went out through the hushed crowd that opened before her, alone, and the doors of that county swung shut behind her in the weeks that came after, one after another in the very pattern in which they had once swung shut on Coralie. And there was no triumph in the watching of it that Coralie could find anywhere in her heart. There was only the tired old rightness of a thing long buried working its way up at the last into the daylight. They cleared her name that spring, in the proper quiet fashion, with the proper papers, in a still room and not a loud one, for all the noise of the thing had been spent on the night of the assembly. It took lawyers, and it took time, and it took the whole weight of a dukedom set behind it, and at the end there was a dry document that said, in the dry language such documents are made of, that the Duchess of Whitcomb, born Coralie Merivale, had been wrongfully accused and stood cleared of every shadow in the death of the late Cassian, and that her good name was restored to her, wholly and forever. She held the dry pages in her 2 hands and read the flat legal words that handed her back the thing torn from her on a night she had never even been present to see. And she wept, at long last, the weeping she had drilled herself for 2 years never to do, and the Duke did not, this once, keep to his silence, and did not reach for any pen. He put his arms around her, and let her cry into his coat, and said not a word, because for once there was no word that needed saying, and it was the fullest and the warmest quiet of that whole long cold winter. He gave her the last thing that same spring, and it was the thing that made the whole of the rest of it solid and true. He came to her in the library at the gray hour where it had all first begun, and he did not write it down, for he had done forever with writing to her, and he said, still a little rough, for the voice had gone 2 years unused and would bear the print of that silence for as long as he lived, that he had a thing to say to her and a thing to ask of her. and that this once he had put them in their proper order. He had seen her name made clean before all the world, he said, and her father's books brought home, and every door in England that had ever shut against her thrown wide again, eager now and ashamed. She stood in want of nothing further from him. She had a name to be proud of once more, and no debt outstanding to any living soul, and he had made dead certain of every part of that before he would let himself say the next thing, because he would not have her stay out of need, or gratitude, or because there was no other roof left for her to go to. There was another roof for her now. There were 1,000 of them. And so he said, I can ask you the clean way, which I could never have asked you in the winter. He stopped, and she saw plainly what it cost him. This man who had rationed his words out one by one so carefully across 2 years, now laying down the most guarded ones of the whole horde. I married you to settle a debt, and it stopped being a debt so long ago that I can no longer put my finger on the day. I have been alone inside my own silence for 2 years, and I never knew it for loneliness until you walked into it and filled it up. Stay, not as the settling of any account, not because you have nowhere better to be, not for any reason under heaven but the one. Stay because you would choose it, freely, out of nothing at all but the choosing. Be my wife in the true fact of it, and not the form. And teach me, he said, and the ghost of the boy his brother had loved rose up for a moment into his hard face to keep on saying these things aloud. For I find I can only bear the saying of them to you, and I have 2 years of them stored up. And Corley, who had come up the Witchcombe Drive with all she owned inside one trunk and no future before her, stood in the library where a frozen man had once set her father's book back on a shelf without a word, and made the choice that was now wholly her own, freely, with no need pressing on her and no fear at her back, wanting not one thing she did not already hold, and choosing purely for the sake of the choice. She lifted her hand and laid it against his hard cheek, which she had never in all their months once done, and she spoke his dead brother's name aloud. Softly, the name that had gone unspoken under that roof for 2 whole years, and she gave it back into his keeping as a thing that might at last be safely held. You never say it, she said. Say it now? And he did, low and rough, and it did not break him, and she saw a thing in him that had been clenched tight for 2 years, come quietly loose and open at the last. Yes, she said then. Yes, I will stay, and I will be your wife, in the true fact of it, and I will teach you to talk, though I give you fair warning. I have grown fond of a few of the silences myself, and I mean to keep some of them. And then she told him the thing she needed him to understand before any other thing at all. You gave me back my name, she said, and it is a great gift, and I will thank you for it all my days. But you gave me a greater thing than my name, and you gave it first, before you had any earthly cause to, and you did it that very first morning without a single word, when you turned my windows away from the sea for a stranger you believed you had every reason on earth to hate. You handed me back a thing I had lost, the certainty that a kindness might be only that, and nothing further, with no price hidden behind it and no blade folded inside it. I had lost that on a cliff 2 years ago, and it was the worst of all the things I lost, worse by far than the name, and you handed it back to me, with a shelf of my father's books before I could be anything to you but a burden. That is the man I am staying for, not only the Duke who found his tongue again in a grand, bright room, though I love him too, and dearly the one who went and bought back the books. They lived out long and good years after that, the once cold Duke and the once ruined Duchess, and they kept between them one small, strange custom that no visitor who did not know the whole story could ever be got to understand. Every morning, at the gray hour before the household stirred, the two of them went down together to the library and sat in a slowly gathering light, and for a while said nothing at all to one another. It was not the old silence any longer, the barred and bolted thing he had once worn like armor plate against the world through 2 bad years. It was that silence turned inside out and wearing the same still face, the quiet that comes only after everything has been said between two people and nothing further is owed, the quiet of a man and a woman who have found that a room may be filled to its four corners with meaning. He did speak in the good years. He had his voice back and used it well and sparingly, always a little rough. And the county that had once named his silence madness came in time to set a higher price on one of his rare dry sentences than on another man's whole day of chatter. For there is no creature so hungry for a thing as the one who has watched it come within a hair of being lost for good. On the wall of the library, framed and hung among the books, she kept the only written thing he had ever given her, the folded scrap with its 3 unsigned words, and beside it, in a small plain frame of its own, the very first of her father's books to find its way home to her. No stranger to the house could ever be made to see why a duchess would hang and treasure so plain a scrap of paper and so worn a little book. But Coralie knew why, and so did he, and between the two of them, that was the whole of it, and enough. The mistress had smiled as the Duchess walked away. But it was the Duke's next words that the whole of that county carried down with it into the grave, every last soul who stood in the room to hear them, for as long as any of them drew breath, and the truest thing the two of them ever came between them to learn was only this, that the deepest love is not the sort that must forever be talking, but the sort that has learned when the hour comes round that a thing must be said out loud, whatever the cost of the saying, to stand up and say it, and to say it aloud in the very place where the wound was first made.